don't know if I'm old as the Pascal language, but that's probably one of the few languages I don't know. I should know by now and pick it up. Well, my name is Greg Paskal. It is good to be with you all today. I've got about an hour presentation in about 45 minutes, so I'm going to do my best, but I do know what it's like to have a food coma, so I'm going to move around a little bit, see if I can stir you guys. I have been working in testing and automation. I can't believe it's been 40 years, but it has. And boy, has time like zipped by. I remember as a 19-year-old going to work for this company called the Hughes Aircraft Company, started by none other than Howard Hughes, if you can believe this. I hired in as a clerk, and I worked with these amazing scientists and folks, and my whole job was to take their blueprints and organize them, and we built things that look kind of like this device right here, a satellite. And those things are flying around up there in outer space to this day. And that's our product. And it was an incredible job to do. And while I was there, you know, when you kind of get that lucky break when you're younger, so a lot of you probably can relate to this. You knew somebody and they got you in the door. That's what happened with me. And so we had an opportunity. I had an opportunity to work in what's called the clean room. Which is essentially getting a little hat and getting a little, you know, a smock and everything, and you go inside a place that's controlled environmentally. And I was bringing some blueprints to a person, a lady named Ruth, who was welding under a microscope. You can imagine how small this was. And I happened to be bringing her these updated blueprints, and I heard her say, "Uh-oh, it happened again." And so I don't know about you, but as a tester, I mean, you're wired kind of as a tester naturally, aren't you? Aren't you? A lot of you guys, you were testers before anybody ever gave you the title of it, right? As a tester, you know what I'm saying? And so I said, "What's going on? Tell me, what do you see?" And I looked under the microscope, and she showed me this hole. It was the size of a pinprick. You couldn't see with your eye without the microscope. Now, this defect had been affecting our company for months. And every time one of these little traveling wave tube amplifiers that go into satellite, they cost about $1 million each to make. They take over a year to build. And they were failing. And as I looked under there, I thought, could that possibly be the root of this bug, this defect? I didn't even call it a defect, this problem. I took it back to my boss, and guess what? It was, I found my first bug, and I got my first promotion. And so I was no longer a clerk. I was moved into a test lab of folks that did life testing at the time. And that's kind of how I got started in all this. A lot of us have stories like that, how we got into these roles. I was really fortunate to have a great opportunity to get into it. So I want to talk to you about quickly about a TED Talk that some of you have seen by this guy named Simon Sinek. Have any of you seen this talk on the why? This is a great talk if you haven't seen it. And it really applies a lot to the work that we do as test engineers. By the way, I've got a lot of feedback recently about using the term test, quality engineers, quality engineering, all that. To me, those are kind of synonymous, so I will use those interchangeably in case you're really sensitive to that sort of thing. Anyway, Simon, in this talk, says before we talk about the what, let's talk about the why of things, which seems like it actually aligns with some of the discussions we've had here today. I've heard folks talk about this, and the same thing applies when it comes to the work that we do as test engineers. So why in the world do we do software testing at all? Why does it matter? Well, at the end of the day, the work that we do is all about reducing risk. Some of you might not have thought of this, but we're there to protect the brand. Our company spent millions of dollars probably building the brand that they have. Some, you know, a lot of expense went into that, and ensuring expectations, right? So our work in the why of what we do ties to these things from my perspective. So as we're laying kind of these foundations, this first foundation is asking why, kind of going back to Simon Sinek's thing. Now, some of the foundations of testing are built on strong testing practices. How many of you know of Joe Colantani? I hope most of you know Joe. You clearly know Joe. And a lot of us have spoke on his show. I've spoke on it many times. These are some different conferences. We've even got our conference right there we're at. Coming to a conference like this is really a privilege. In fact, I wrote a whole paper on this idea, how to attend a conference well, because some of you were sent from your company on their dime to come here. And how do you do this work well? How do you come here and do it well? Because when we come away from it, our employers expect that there's something they're going to get from what we do, right? From us being here, more than just taking a 3 or 4 day vacation. So it's great to get foundations. I personally find coming to a conference like this is really awesome. Kosta's talk earlier was like, man, I said that talk alone was worth it for me because I'm really into IoT. And some of you you're gonna love the talks, and then there's gonna be one that's gonna stand out. You're gonna be like, that made the whole cost of this worth it. So maybe part of my talk will be like that, or you've got one that you're going to go to later on. But I want to encourage you that there's probably a nugget here for you to grasp. That's going to be, you're going to be able to take back to your manager, and they're going to say, man, I'm happy I sent you to that. Take time to tell them what in the world you learned from here. It's really important. When it comes to the foundations of testing, one of the first things that I like to do is build a common vocabulary. And so I gave an example here. I'm a big ICQB guy. I know some people really dislike them, but I like the foundation of what they lay. And one of the things that they do is they talk about a concept called positive, negative, and boundary testing. Hopefully those terms aren't new to any of you. And maybe you use terms like happy path testing. It's a term actually I don't like at all, because happy only leads to sad, and there's no such thing as melancholy testing, which is where you really find all the defects. Okay? So, but terminology really matters with your team. And the things that you as a team discuss and describe in certain ways matter. I just came from a company that had 2 different definitions for the word bug and defect. They didn't mean the same thing. And it added a lot of confusion. In our space of quality engineering, by the way, did you know there's multiple philosophies of how to do testing, and there's even different terms for it? So whatever you choose to do, matter of fact, if you move into a new company, make sure you ask, so tell me what you mean by test case, test suite. These sort of things are important. Test step, a test plan, what is that? So that you have a common understanding of it. So language really matters. Now there's some traps that happen when we get into the foundation of testing. Sometimes we get into this place where the focus is the wrong thing. And we're really not, we're doing testing, we're really not testing the things that matter. There's this problem of making it up as we go. I could think of an engineer I worked with. He loved exploratory testing. I could not get him to do a test plan if his life depended on it. That's a problem at the end of the day. Nobody really loves to do lots of documentation, but planning what you're going to test matters at the end of the day. If you go 100% exploratory, you're kind of making it up as you go. It's really fun, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not a good risk strategy at the end of the day. And then they reinvent test engineering. So they might come up with a whole new approach to what that might look like. The example of using bug and defect not meaning the same thing, or jargon like happy path. What about recreating defect reporting and that sort of thing? Where or this one I love. How many of you built your own bug tracker in house? Right? I don't know how many people have taken what is it, Microsoft's database app, and built their own bug defect tracking system. Right? Some of these tools that are already out there that help solve these problems. So there's a second fundamental I like to talk about, and it really is based on a manual test strategy. So once upon a time, there was this guy. His name was Greg, and he worked for a company called Kinko's. How many of you ever used Kinko's, right? Lots of us. I worked for them for a while. It's the first place I ever worked where I had the role or the title of quality assurance. And I was given the task to test all kinds of things. I have one test that was crazy. I had to test we were doing a campaign where we were giving $5,000 away. And lo and behold, I decided to call the phone number. And guess what? It wasn't going to the right place. So the people that would have tried to enter the contest would have been really surprised. And the person on the end of the phone line would have been surprised too. But as I started to learn more about testing, I basically just took out a yellow tablet like all of us have, something looked like this. And I began to just write down what I would like to test if I had all the time in the world. Because what I found was things were given to me, and I was given the task of completing the entire work in an hour or 2 hours, right? We all can relate to this reality that you would love to have a week and you're given only a day or whatever it is. I have found during those times, my brain checks out under the stress. And then something gets shipped. And then later on, I find out, crud, I didn't click the submit link, or whatever, silly thing makes sense when I'm in my right mind. So out of that, I began to build a checklist, and I put it into Excel. I'm actually going to be teaching a whole workshop on this tomorrow for those of you that are coming. And I built a methodology called the METS methodology. It stands for the Minimal Essential Test Strategy. It's used all over the world now. It's really exciting. I got to meet with an airline that's using it. It's used by Trivago. A bunch of companies are using it, so it's pretty neat. That's something that just started off as an Excel spreadsheet is now being used by so many folks. So if you think about a manual test strategy and your application, think about the most obvious page of your application, whether it's mobile or web. What if you could only test one thing? You only had a chance to test one thing. What would be that one thing you would absolutely make sure works? That's probably a critical test. Okay. And so if you start to look at your application from this aspect of what's critical, high, medium, and low, like I use an example here of this vehicle. If we were testing this vehicle, we probably would want to make sure it has 4 tires on it, right? That's pretty critical at the end of the day. And so I might take my spreadsheet and say, well, let's make sure that from a tires perspective, there are 4 of them before I begin to drive away. Okay. Something that's maybe not as critical to the aspects of the tires is their condition, because let's face it, how many of us have driven with tires that need to be replaced for a while? You can go for a little while, right? I live in Tennessee now where we get plenty of ice, so that's probably not a good idea. I'm sure those of you that live in the Pacific Northwest know that too. But when I came from Southern California, I could drive a lot longer on pretty bad tires for a while. Maybe medium on that scale of priority would be the pressure, because you can still drive even with low pressure tires. And maybe the lowest thing it would be the balance of those tires. So this idea of prioritization is important when it comes to the METS methodology and when it comes to your test planning. At the end of the day, my last employer looked at METS as their test methodology or their test planning approach. And I like that a lot because it's very adaptable and it can be used alongside an existing test methodology if you have it. So by the way, you can check out this stuff at metstesting.com. I've got a whole website. I've even got a Udemy course on it now. So it's all of 40 minutes, so it's real quick. Let's go to our third fundamental, which is around executing the test strategy. So first of all, just have a plan, right? And I should have brought it with me. And I kind of played around with the DevOps loop here on purpose. But I like this idea that for a tester, I want to ingrain in their head, plan your test and test your plan. That's not that hard, right? Plan what you're going to do and then just execute it. Test the plan. That seems really straightforward. It's not overly complicated. And you can drive this idea home that once you're done with the test that you've run, go back and refine the plan a little bit. Make it a little bit better, right? You can continue to refine. Test plan doesn't have to be this agonizing experience that a lot of us know of, right? I really don't know too many test engineers that love the idea of breaking out Word and creating this, 50-page document that they're never going to return to again because someone asked them to do it. This is where our METS concept really came in handy, because now we had a test plan, which was just a spreadsheet, and we knew right off the bat what was critical. And we said in our test plan today, we're going to just run the critical test. I've got 2 hours, so I'm going to run all the criticals. I'm going to merge over to the high priority test. I'm going to run as many of those as I can. But my test plan is done, but at least I had a plan. So here's like a typical test plan here. I might execute the automation. I might execute all my critical tests. I'm going to perform some level of exploratory testing because let's face it, you find the good stuff there too, right? Some testers are just wired and they're great exploratory testers. And then they're going to go ahead and update their test plan. I love to encourage ownership. One of my favorite things is mentoring test engineers. I've mentored some great ones along the journey. And I like to find that thing that they love to do. So some of you really do like documentation here. It's crazy, but there probably are some of you out there that do. Some of you really like to be tenacious and meticulous going through your application and finding those defects that are hard to find. You're really good at diving in, maybe at the back-end API layer, or whatever it might be. Maybe you love using an API tool like what's the API tool? I've forgotten all of a sudden, the one that you guys all use. What was that? Yeah, or SOAP UI, one of these kinds of things, right? And maybe you love to go and tear data apart and dive into it. Postman, the tool I was thinking of. Let's see, I don't think I've got anything on that. I had one guy, and his passion was shift left testing. The guy had like a wiring for it. And you know what he did? He hung out with the devs a lot, and he snuck into their meetings at the times they were on the whiteboard, and he's like, there's this thing here, guys. Remember, you have to create a way for the person who forgot their password, or there was some exception. He just was wired that way, and I like that I had a guy on a team like that, because I could go ahead and deploy him into another team if I needed to, and he could go ahead and move in his expertise, right? We're kind of generalists, but it's okay to become a specialist. If anything, your boss is probably going to love that they've got someone who specializes in looking through the lens of accessibility or security. That's very valuable. So again, looking back at this METS idea, if I execute my strategy, this is kind of a generic METS that I created. By the way, I have a bunch of these worksheets. There's some generic ones out there that you're welcome to take. I think this is the one I created for a very generic one for testing a web page. This could be maybe even 20 years old, but you can see down here, I basically created a category, and from the categories, then I started creating what is critical. So if you have a page, I know it's kind of hard to see, what would be the most critical thing? Page completely loads, right? It's a no-brainer, right? It makes sense now because we're not under the gun. Now, if somebody gave you 10 minutes to go make sure that their landing page was working, that just might get checked out. You might not even think about it because all you want to make sure is that the person can authenticate and log in, and you didn't verify that you could that the page was even loading completely. I know it's a very simplified example, but I really want to encourage you to think about this idea. Now, when I started putting this presentation together, let me have a drink here, I started thinking about what were the common traps that you run into with each of these foundations. So here's some traps with these foundations. Rewriting test cases for every release. I hope none of you are doing this. All right. This is kind of a contractor's dream come true. All right. You somehow convince the customer that you need to keep rewriting the same test cases. All right. You shouldn't need to do that. Man, if you want to get one that's going to get under my goat, is when I hear test engineers say the words, I just don't care about this, or I don't care about that. You want to show some ownership of your application, care about it. Don't use those terms. They're like a cancer into a quality team. As soon as someone utters it, I swear, the rest of the team begins to adopt this idea. It's like a siloed mindset, which says, this is my space. I don't really care what's over here. This is what I really want to care about. It really needs to be broader than that. It's not going to overwhelm you. You don't have to own all this, but your interest in it matters because you're the quality advocate. You're the advocate for that customer or for your brand or whatever. So of course you want to care about it. A love affair with tools. I know I love tools, but if we get too caught up in the tools usually don't solve the problem. You're the problem solver, and you bring the tool to the table, right, to help you solve the problem, including automation, by the way. Okay. Let's talk about number 4 here, fundamental. So why test automation? I like test automation. I literally have been writing test automation for 40 years. We just didn't call it that to begin with. My first test automation was written on an Apple II. If any of you have ever used an old machine like that, it was written in assembly language. I had to build the hardware, and it was testing that spaceflight hardware. It had to run fast, so I had to learn how to write assembly language and execute it. But nowadays, we've got all kinds of tools and capabilities to help us with this. So let's think about the why behind automation. Automation, you notice some of you might have thought this first slide would come up because it's fast. That's not a good reason to automate. Automate because it's consistent. It does the same thing over and over and over again. That's the reason you automate. And guess what? Out of good automation, you get some speed. If you flip those two around, you'll find you'll focus on the wrong thing, I promise. Focus on consistency of execution. You're trying to have confidence in your tool. When I train my automation engineers, I teach them a principle. And by the way, I have this on my YouTube channel. It's called Go for Green. And there's actually a video that's called the 5 times test, I think, craftoftesting.com. And I say, whenever you complete the development of an automated test, I need you to run it 5 times in a row. It needs to run exactly the same. There's no averaging. It passed 4 times and it failed once. It needs to run consistency. I just picked 5 out of the air, but automation can be that reliable without any special tooling at all. It's all in the discipline of doing it well. The good thing about automation is it reveals anomalies. I went to this Google conference. They don't have it anymore. It was called GTAC. I don't know, Phil, you might have been to that conference at some point. GTAC conference put on by Google was a great conference. And I learned something that I began to apply in my automation, which is most folks run their automation and then they run it again and they try to do their best to remember how it ran the last time. And this guy at the Google conference, he now works at Apple. He said, you need to figure out a way to measure everything. And so I started to get that in mind. And in my company, they began to talk about something called a data lake. And I began to put it in what I eventually learned was the elastic stack, the ELK stack. Some of you are familiar with that. You know, we found more defects by looking at the historical data run of soft fails that were still passing. Because the defects were there, the data was telling us something was coming, but the test was still passing. So it's very valuable when you start to see anomalies. You as a human can only remember so much. So if you try to remember, look, yesterday it ran like this and now it ran 10 seconds. Well, it's only 10 seconds. I got to go to lunch or I got to meet Bob for coffee or whatever it is. But if you start to see in your data degradation, a regression, by the way, a regression in your data, now you know something's up because the code is the same, right? It's a really, really great place. And your automation can tell you that. So your automation, I think, should be built on a manual test strategy. The way that we did it with our team is anything that's in the critical column, we did our best to automate it if it was a good automation candidate. Not everything was. So we had to evaluate whether it was. We didn't put any numbers in place. We don't say we're going to automate 80% of everything or 20% of this or whatever. I personally think that's a mistake. You're going to begin to automate the wrong things. Automate the right things. And if it comes out to 90%, cool. If it comes out to 10% because it's the right thing, great. You did the right thing. You used the wisdom that you've been given to go ahead and apply your testing knowledge, your risk assessing knowledge in a tool we happen to call automation, and you applied it in the right place. Now, some of the other things when it comes to your automation methodology is you need to determine what OS the team is going to run on or that you're going to work with. Language, I just learned Ruby about 8 years ago. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. I've been learning C++. I like it. So, but I'm a nerd and I'm learning IoT stuff. You need to determine what browsers you're going to run it in, of course, and what devices you're going to decide to run it in. I don't honestly believe you need to run it in all these too. That might surprise you. And so there is this, I think it's a myth. And someone will say, well, there's this many browsers with this many versions or this many phones with this many things. How many of you know you can run every single possible test on a device? It's impossible, right? You can't run every possible test. Our work is all about risk assessment. So whatever you have, kind of going back to that Mets mindset, if you've got an hour, if you've got a week, if you've got a month, you're going to apply your test approach, your test methodology with the time you've got. So even if you hit every Android version you could, you might have skipped one iOS version where some bug was. That's just part of being a good risk assessor. Find out where the curve is, where most of your folks are using your app and choose to use that, right? Most of these defects will repeat on other devices, but there will always be those few that will slip by. It's just the reality of it. If you've got all the time in the world, that's great. You can do it. But from my experience, I tend to find 2 or 3 environments and I focus on doing those well. That doesn't overwhelm the test team. It helps keep them focused. And very rarely has anything shown up. I can only think of one time we had a defect that showed up in Safari out of all the crazy things. It was in Safari. We got a little backlash from it. It wasn't the end of the world. I didn't get any bullet holes. I was in good shape. And we talked about how we might offset it down the road, and we went forward. So all that other extra testing wouldn't have really brought us any additional benefits. So from an automation reality check, if you find it in one environment, you tend to find it in multiples, okay? It's not a replacement for manual testers. I think everybody here feels pretty strongly about that. Remember this, an automation demo sells software, okay? I don't know how many times we've got to watch an automation demo authenticate into an application and been told, look, it'll do this, okay? These tools, they're expensive, and people are selling these tools, I get it. But a demo has done that. A demo is meant to sell a tool. It doesn't always represent, but you're going to have to perform with it. So be wise about that. Okay? Huh? What's that? Joe Colantonio and I had a talk one day about record and playback. And because I had a riff about it, to be really honest. I wasn't really thrilled about it. To be honest, I started there. That's how I learned. And he said, Greg, this is actually still okay because a lot of people get introduced through automation through that. I'm good with that. It has a limit, all right? You're probably not going to build your whole suite with record and playback. If you do see me, I'd love to hear how you did it. But this is just another kind of sales tool. It introduces us to it, okay? Some of the traps that we can find here, nothing is really free in automation. I did a survey a few years ago and I said, why did you choose the automation tool you did? What do you think most people chose the automation tool? It was free. That's the top reason. Okay, that's why they chose Selenium. It was free. But at the end of the day, you think it's really free? Not free. Before this, I used HP's tools, which are now owned by OpenText, I think. It's gone through multiple rounds. Those are some expensive tools. Okay. So a lot of people avoided it just because they're expensive. I get that. But at the end of the day, none of these tools are really free. When I started learning Selenium, I had to go ahead and learn Ruby along with it and RSpec and how to build a framework in it. I was able to take my HP knowledge and apply it in there. But it's naive to think I used it because it's free, because it's still going to cost you something. Okay, and be ready for the expense. So, for instance, we started to use BrowserStack, and we were experimenting with that. That wasn't free. Okay, well, we wanted to play around with that. So I like to encourage those managers, even if you think you're using a free tool set, put some budget in place for these guys. They're going to need it. Anyway, it could be the API tool they're going to need. I know what it is, Postman. Licensing for Postman allows you to get it free until your company's a certain size, and then you can't legally just use it free anymore. So that's a great example of a company that matured to the point where the licensing agreement was no longer allowed to be used for free. So we had to plan on that. If it's consultant built, for Pete's sake, have some plans for a handoff. If you were working in this space, please plan on early on how you're going to hand it off to the customer so they can keep it going, because there's a lot of bad rap about what we build out there not being valuable at the end of the day. That's because that's forgotten. So when it comes to automating, I think I shared this earlier. I like this idea that we automate the critical test. I've got it in a few different tools here, but that's what we shoot for to begin with. And then we move into our highs and mediums and lows from there. I worked for this manager when I worked for the JCPenney company who introduced this concept of the N-curve effect. Have any of you heard this idea, the N-curve effect? All right, so let me explain how it works. This is what happens for a lot of folks that are asked to automate to begin with. All right, so this yellow line, let's assume this is a single test case, okay? They have to automate a single test case. It could even be login for that matter, okay? Brutal to build the first test case. You're having to put the framework in place. You're having to build out your page objects or your locators, whatever it is. This can wear out an automation engineer to begin with. And the manager's like, come on, I thought we'd have 10 automated test cases already. Plan on the fact that there's an N curve and it's hard to get the first test case done. And as you continue to build up more test cases, guess what? It gets easier. It gets easier because you have more page objects built or whatever it might be, and it's simpler and simpler. And automation follows the same exact thing. So if you've got a team and they're going to have to automate, plan on the fact if it's brand new, it's going to take them a while to climb up this end curve, and then they're going to get the hang of it. So cut them a little slack when you, as a manager, when you turn that guy over or that gal over to automating or maintaining something, give them a little bit of confidence boost. Hey, I realize you've never seen this code before, so I expect it's going to take you a little while. That's okay. I know it. Go through it. Get stuck. Let me know. But it's going to smooth out once you get a hang of it. Okay. Maybe you have to learn their method libraries or whatever. I'm going to cover this other line here in a little bit because it's kind of a fun one. So when you build your automation, try to store things consistently. This is kind of one of my earlier slides. I have found that this has just helped me. I'm totally one of those organizer guys. If you saw my garage, you'd know it's full of plastic boxes that I can see in, and they're all on shelves evenly spaced. So I'm one of those highly organized people. I just have to have order to it. So I try to do the same thing with my test assets from the scripts and the libraries and everything. I look for consistency in my naming convention. So for instance, my page objects all begin with PO, and all my locators begin with LO. It's just one of those things I do, and my team, as they adopted it, they really love this concept. So find an approach like that brings some consistency to it, and as much as you can, mirror the physical application, and try to avoid the abbreviations. Unless your OS is really holding you back from this, there is this tendency to start off with, maybe calling login LI or something like that. Go ahead and use more verbose language. In the long run, the sustainability and the maintainability you'll really notice it. It'll make it easier because it's gonna speak for itself. Find that logical groupings and consistency across the project. Now, some of the traps that I've got here, let's see how we're doing in time, is all automated tests should be traceable back to a manual test case. That for me is very important. Okay. It's one of those things that get skipped. If that automated test fails, you got to go back and perform the test. Is it really the test that failed? You have to have something to go back to. So at least with the METS concept, you remember how I showed you the critical, high, medium, and low? Well, what we ask from our test engineers is the criticals are all documented. The test case is documented out. And actually, the automation is written so clear, you could almost run the manual test case just by looking at the automated script. It's very obvious what it's doing. So it should be traceable back to a manual test case. You can always run into a problem when the automation is more complex than the thing you're testing. Okay, that's a really good sanity test to put in place. Is if you're going to build this Frankenstein test to test a simple thing, it's probably not worth doing. It's tied to a specific user, computers, credentials, all that kind of stuff. It's overly complicated to use, and there's no historical reporting. I know that's a big lift. For some of you, you've never maybe considered, how am I going to historically record the results from my automation? I can guarantee it. If you begin to move into that, you will start to see things you've never seen that are in the data, right? Would it surprise you that data tells you something? The data from the automated test is going to tell you something. Now I want to go back to this graph one more time here, this image, and I want to talk about something called the ROI roller coaster. This red line here represents the ROI roller coaster. And it's good to recognize when you see this show up in your automation. Okay, remember how you climb this N-curve effect? That's a reality you're going to run into. It's very normal. What's not normal is once that engineer figures out how this thing works, that they get a hang of it, and all of a sudden they're like, I got it. Oh my gosh, I don't got it again. I got it. Oh, I got it. Wait, what's happening here? I don't figure it out. If you have this roller coaster effect where it seems like they figured it out, and then all of a sudden it's really hard, it's telling you something about the methodology in place. It could be that there's no methodology in place. It's just kind of flying by the seat of the pants. So if you start to see this idea where it's really hard and then you feel like they've got it, and all of a sudden they can't figure it out again, I would dig into that. That's telling you something about the methodology problem going on. Maybe somebody isn't taking the lead. The lead automation engineer should be setting some sort of expectation for how this is built. And so I really like this idea. I added this on from the N-curve effect because I've seen it happen multiple times. It's usually a rogue automation engineer. I'm going to just kind of throw out that term there. It's somebody who just loves automating everything in sight and they're bored. Usually just bored and they're automating everything they can dream of. I worked with one guy, he automated his bank account balance, and things like that. So if you're seeing this crazy sort of thing and you're like, how did this get in the suite? It's good to figure out what's going on with that. It eats up the ROI that you can spend in much more important things. All right, just got a couple more here. From the manual test perspective, I like my automation folks to run their automation every day. As a matter of fact, we asked them usually to run it twice, and I usually scheduled their first run. So when they came in the morning, I used Jenkins to get it scheduled. Their suite would run, and guess what? Because we had historical reporting, it was in their inbox. When they came in the morning, they reviewed their results, and it let them know what they were starting off with every morning. It was a great time saver for them. We run it at the same time, on the same environment, in the same order, regardless of a new code build. Now, some folks usually get really uncomfortable with this because they're like, why don't we run it random? Because you're going to want to identify when things are working differently. Okay, there's a time to run things random. This is not the time to do that. Okay, so look for the idea of doing it the same way because you're going to want to identify. I think my next slide shows this. Yep. Let me go into it. What I call the personality of the application. All right, applications have personalities. All right, some of them are super cooperative. They always run perfect. They're super consistent and predictable. These have probably been in the enterprise for a long time. That's not the only kind you run into. You have these stubborn applications. At least they're stubborn all the time, right? If they're stubborn some of the times, you've got a defect probably floating around out there, right? They're temperamental, inconsistent, they're unpredictable. You've got this tired, latent problem where you have an application that's slow to run and latent. This is one nice thing about being able to schedule it before the tester comes in. So, this one gets done in 10 minutes and this one takes an hour to run. At least I can schedule it out. So when they come in, they can see, yep, she's just as tired as she was yesterday, and so you have a sense that it's consistent. Or it requires very specific, it's very strict in its conditions of how it runs. So I like to think of the idea that the personality of the application, like to know that as a test engineer or as the automation engineer, understand the nature of your application. Now, when the automation fails, of course, just go ahead and kick it off again. All right, it's not going to hurt you to do it. But I want to talk about. I'm going to come up with one more thing here in a second. But you're going to, of course, look for the same results. But I want to talk about something called flaky test. Right? I'd love for you to grasp this idea of this definition. Because a lot of folks, who hasn't heard of flaky test here? Flaky automation, you have it. Okay. So flaky automation, I want to define it for you, is or it could be flaky test, but it's any test or automation that you run that produces a different result twice in a row. Same environment, same code base and everything. If you're seeing your test run different, you got a automation problem. You've got some sort of test engineering problem. You should expect your test to run exactly the same on the same environment multiple times. Don't average it out. If you have to average it out, it's telling you something about your automation methodology. All right, two basic things always tie to that is for locator approach and a synchronization problem. All right, we can go into that offline if you like, but I have a bunch of videos on my YouTube channel on that. But flaky tests are not tied to a tool; they're tied to an approach. All right, I don't know how many people have left one tool to the next because they say Selenium's flaky, so I decided to go to Cypress, and I decided to go to Playwright. You're going to find the same flakiness there because guess who showed up? You're still behind the driver's seat, man. You're introducing the same defects, the same problems, the same automation methodology over and over again. You should expect consistency from your automation. It's possible to do. This is probably one of the biggest ones I debate on LinkedIn with folks, is they say they're going to bail on a tool because this tool is flaky. It's not, it's their approach. And let's face it, maybe they didn't have any coaching, but I want you to grasp this idea so you can have a word. Remember, our first step was to have a vocabulary. So when you talk about a flaky test, which can happen even manually, I got to dig in here. Something's not right. Now, you can have a flaky application, by the way, as well. Now your automation has found a defect, right? Some common traps here is when manual testers use automation is they're required to become command line experts. This drives me nuts. It should be able to click a button or whatever. It should be pretty easy to use. But for whatever reason, I think that's us Unix people like that to be able to run things from the command line. The problem is they have to run it on their local machine. I hope you've got some VMs or something in place where you can run on some very consistent environments. Try to disable browser updates. Things like the Selenium WebDriver can get really funny when the browser changes. By the way, in the Ruby space, there's a gem that solves that problem. And I'm sure there are in some other languages too. All right, I think I got one last one to do here, and we'll wrap it up. So just some of the partnerships that I want to encourage you is, of course, the QA and automation engineers. These folks should enjoy spending time together. All right, they should be buddies. Sometimes it's the same person, but I like them to be two different people. Personally, if I have my wish on it, your dev engineers and your QA folks and your DevOps folks, if you can find nice harmony between all these people, you're probably going to do yourself a favor. So, buy some donuts or whatever you got to do to get everybody together and try to build this within the team, because these developer folks over here are going to be some of your best advocates. If your automation engineer needs some good locators built in, they can build those things in for them, but they've got to begin to build those relationships so they have a good partnership. Let's see, I think I've covered pretty much most of this, but I want to get into these traps here. Some of the traps in this space are QA becoming the software police. That really stinks. Living up to the kind of the stereotype technologist. I love to squash imposter syndrome because everybody's learning. I've been doing this a long time, and I still constantly come up with things. I'm like, I don't know what this is. I need some help understanding it. That's okay. So let those sort of things be, something you're aware of, and try, I know there's a talk coming up. Andrea's going to do this, and you're going to learn some good stuff. But that's in our keynote, isn't it? Is it today? Our closing keynote. You got to listen to this keynote about compassion. No, did I get the right word? Empathy. Yeah, I think it ties into that last slide and how you can build some great partnerships and relationships by empathizing with the folks that are building stuff. So just some final thoughts. This is a great ways to get a hold of me. If you just Google Greg Paskal, I'm all over the web. I probably connected with half of you in this room on LinkedIn, and I'd love to connect with the rest of you. Check out my podcast at craftoftesting.com. That'll just redirect you to my YouTube channel. I hope some of you are taking my workshop. Is anybody in here taking the workshop tomorrow? Cool. All right, I got some really good stuff I've added to that. I've got a book out on Amazon. It's on Audible as well now. And I think that's it.